Good morning. Today is Sunday, December the 13th. We are dialing in from three different spots on the planet today. I am Chris Bolton, CEO of TheraCann International. Happy to be back in our Center of Excellence here in Panama Pacifico, Republic of Panama. To my left, we have Marcus Ramikison, who's dialed in, of course, from the Caribbean. He's going to chat about activities in his backyard, of course. And we have our friend below who is dialed in from the lovely island of Vancouver, Victoria, and that's Robert Laurie. All right, lots to cover off here today. Rob, you're going to weigh in with regards to Europe and, of course, the United States and a little bit of going on in Canada, and then up to Marcus and then back to me. Go ahead.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Robert Laurie. I'm Senior Advisor to TheraCann International Benchmark Corporation, which is a leading global full turnkey solutions and critical infrastructure provider for the regulated food, cannabis, and psychedelic industries. I'm also a practicing lawyer with international credentials, qualified and called to the bar in British Columbia. So yeah, here we're going to talk about today the developments briefly in the European Union regarding the Canavape CBD case. This was a recent decision back in the end of November where the highest court in Europe, the European Court of Justice, ruled that the French national ban on CBD is illegal and that CBD is not a narcotic. The courts effectively found that the French law prohibiting the sale of CBD came down to whether or not the extraction dealt with parts of the plant or the whole plant. And as Canavape had been importing full plant CBD from a licensed legal supplier in the Czech Republic, it challenged the issue in European Union law dealing with free movement of goods. I can remember back to, second, third year law at Oxford studying full EU law, the Van Gandenloos case back in the 60s, which was the first seminal case dealing with movement of people and goods. And that's effectively what we see the challenge here is you have legalities popping up or countries within the European Union doing things one way and other countries interpreting the law in another way. And so it's interesting in that, again, because many of the products that are currently sold in the EU, well, some come from the legal gray area and others come from the legal medical regulated arena. So those are my thoughts. Marcus, do you want to jump in at all on any of the EU?
Sorry, right. There hasn't been a lot of changes that I can tell you about in the Caribbean, specifically within the last couple of months since our last session here. Barbados, of course, is the only country that has announced that they are going forward with their legislation and their regulations, but nothing's really been shown for it, right? They haven't put out a draft or anything close to. Here in Trinidad, of course, I think we're waiting on Barbados. St. Kitts is going to get back on their consultations for their regulations. I've had a call from them to consult possibly, so start back consulting for them. So I guess they're going to start back soon. I think one of the biggest things that happened since our last talk was the United Nations Commission on Narcotic Drugs decision. They had 6 decisions to make regarding changes to the single convention, and only one had passed, and that one passed 27 to 25, so just by 2 votes really. Everything else was shut down. And the one that passed was basically that they would remove cannabis and cannabis resin from Schedule 4 of the international drug schedules. I've seen that celebrated a lot of social media sites, but I don't think there's real understanding that it remains on Schedule 1. Particularly scheduling the drugs or scheduling cannabis, let's say specifically, amidst other drugs in both Schedule 1 and Schedule 4, is something of a reiteration in the writing of the treaties themselves. There was no real class separation between 1 and 4, except that Schedule 1 was more dangerous. Schedule 4 still had very limited medicinal value and still had very addictive properties. Specifically for Schedule 4, countries were allowed to make their own rules guiding these products medicinally, but it's the same thing in Schedule 1. So again, it's a reiteration. It's saying that the CND made no real change to the schedules, to the conventions that can assist in any movement of cannabis in the upcoming future. We've also seen the last week's the MORE Act passed by the House of Representatives in the US. This act, of course, it's not large, but it's very detailed, and it works towards opening up the entire industry for both banking, for sales, and for regulated business, for social equity programs, a number of things. But my fear, of course, is that just like most of the other acts that we've seen, States Act and these other things, it may pass House, but will it get to Senate? When will it get to Senate? Also saw just this week, I didn't get time to do the research, and did that the House also passed another bill regarding hemp and hemp CBD throughout the federal US. But again, all these plants still containing THC, still not being defined as hemp, and differentiating hemp within the single convention is not going to make any real changes. One of the biggest things that I think I've seen that shook me was that Israel has been announcing that they're looking at recreational cannabis or non-medical adult use. This was news to me, having met with some of the authorities there just in December last year, where they were adamant about remaining medical and not looking at recreational at all. I do know that they are working with the US federal government on advising for cannabis and for cannabis strategies. So I can only hope that if they've announced that they are going non-medical adult use, that hopefully the US will see its way to follow suit and look towards the same goal. Maybe we'll see what everyone has been hoping for, and we will get to see maybe some form of regulation coming from the federal government in the US, hopefully as early as next year. I think that's it for me for my wrap up.
Yeah, thanks, guys. So there is an interesting end to the year. If we start at the other end of the planet, New Zealand was signaling to licensees that receiving biomass from hemp for production of oil may not be available as a legitimate way to derive cannabis oil. And we have worked with a variety of different states, new entries into the market in Africa, where they too are clearly dividing what we'll call industrial hemp from what others will call commercial cannabis. Commercial cannabis for them is something that contains THC. Industrial hemp is something that doesn't, which artificially is measured at that 0.03 or below level for THC, but every other molecule is just not addressed. It's just forgotten. And that's not realistic to think that this plant, which really is one species, one common species with different expressions, is somehow going to be easily regulated that way. Now, I'm thinking about jurisdictions where they don't have adequate labs to measure, let alone get results that are internationally defensible. I'm thinking about countries that definitely need to control their feedstock, whether it's seeds, clones, or tissue culture, and how they're going to start all this. But they have to wrap their heads around, at the end of the day, does the company or person that's sinking a lot of money and taking incredible risk is going to have a product that's marketable at the end of the day? Now, I feel that they will. I still have confidence that these governments will find their way. We are seeing, extraordinary growth still in markets such as South Africa and Lesotho. We were very happy to see that within 12 and a half months of heavy work done in Zimbabwe, that 44 licenses had been granted When I was last there with members of my team in April of last year, there were maybe 11 of them questionably, maybe only 7 of them, but they were all related to government site projects. And then the door came off that, and these could be put on private location. Well, in Zimbabwe, nothing's really private, but be able to put them on locations other than just a government facility. So obviously that worked. And it brought a lot of revenue into Zimbabwe for the purpose of investment. But then last week, they announced that they would more than double, in some cases, the taxes on seed, on bulk mass, and on oil for export, which of course sent shivers through the investment community trying to figure out, well, what does that mean? At the end of the day, the costs of operation are still ridiculously low, and so maybe it all balances out when we look at it to the cost of other competing countries, but still being cheaper perhaps there than here in LATAM, but still that's a last minute change in an industry that isn't fully developed. So getting back to the big one though, trying to better understand what it is we can and cannot sell internationally is still gray. It's not terribly black and white yet. We still have projects that are racing forward very quickly on the grounds that they're being exported for medical research and development. And that's great news. But being able to get it into that next market would be very interesting. We thought New Zealand would have passed for recreational and become the 3rd country in the world. Within plus or minus, depending on that final vote count, it was close. It was well within 5 to 6% of passage. And then Colombia, out of the blue, popped up and said, we want to do recreational now. And we are. Didn't see that coming that quickly. Any of you see Colombia moving that quickly?
I was surprised with hearing it. I still didn't get time to follow it. I had some finals on my master's this last week, but saw it through social media, which is the way most of us get some news these days. And, they were doing some things wrong when it came to medicinal legislature. And I don't know if they would have, it was already in between medicinal and recreational, if you will, because they were already allowing cultivation at home and all these things. So the move isn't, I guess it's surprising because of international law, right? They must understand that this presents certain potential challenges to their government and their governance from the international bodies, from the INCB, unless, of course, they haven't spoken to them. And my experience in the Caribbean has been that most governments really had no understanding of their obligations to the international treaties to begin with.
Yeah.
There were guidelines. They weren't aware that they were allowed to do medicinal, and there's simply no understanding. I keep saying that one of the main reasons my job to advise these governments was because I was able to explain the treaty obligations, able to explain what they needed to do to stay in compliance and all these things. And that seemed to have fascinated them. I was surprised. Attorney generals should have understood the obligations of these laws for their countries, in my opinion.
But it's interesting, Marcus.
Yeah.
Just to jump in on that, you gotta, be an interesting historiography from the point of view of prohibition and drug legislation. We all know why the United States was behind this, but take countries like Ghana in Africa, or most of the Caribbean nations and LATAM. I'm willing to bet that the evidence in the historiography will demonstrate that effectively the U.S. pointed a gun or a barrel at the head of most of these countries, and it was like, you sign this, get behind this, or there'll be repercussions.
Well, definitely when conventions came about, I can tell you from 61, exactly, right? And Trinidad became independent from Great Britain in 1962. I think some of the islands in the Caribbean became independent as late as 79, if I'm not mistaken.
In 1957, Australia was dropping atomic weapons in the outback on its own indigenous people without telling them. So that's 1957. Then you're looking at 1961 for drug laws. Again, maybe you and I should do this. We should write the historiography of how effectively the colonial countries, the third world, and everybody but NATO countries, how were they coerced or induced to sign to this legislation? Because
I can tell you.
Regardless, though, we're heading into a 2021 year, and we still have this massive demand.
yes,
We're seeing the demand also being paralleled now for other psychedelics at a speed that's well beyond light speed for cannabis now. We watched in keen interest within months, countries were flipping directly into psilocybin and into other derivatives for the purpose of psychological help, whether that was depression or other PTSD, for example, very effective according to the researchers, of course. And again, legislation's not prepared. They decide, well, we'll just go easy on that for now. What? We fought for cannabis for decades. And for the last 7 years, they've made our lives absolutely living hell with regards to opening legitimate banking, being able to work in countries with complete transparency. And then literally overnight, the other drugs were not treated the same.
you still can't do anything with them internationally under the present law. So don't feel too bad, Chris. There's still a lot of work to do.
Yeah,
Yeah, states and countries that are opening up for psychedelics, I'm very proud of them, and I really hope to see research come out of them, because I mean, you ask any physician today about cannabis, I mean, outside of course from the countries that have had legislation for years, they will tell you the same thing, that they need to see the research, and not enough research is done. We do have a lot of research, but we still don't understand exactly how cannabis is metabolized within our bodies. There's still steps within the glucuronidation stage of CBD and THC in our livers that we don't know which enzyme does it, right? And these enzymes can be important for the metabolism of other drugs that people can be taking for very deleterious or important health reasons. You know, so it's something that needs to be researched more so that we can understand better contraindications to use, right? It is a chemical, a xenobiotic going into our bodies, right? Whether or not we produce the same molecule naturally, it is considered a xenobiotic, and it does, it can affect us in different ways. We don't know yet if certain other cannabinoids that we now seek to develop through strain select, maybe CBT, right? How would CBT in larger amounts affect us? We have no idea. Right, so really, research needs to be done on both cannabis and psychedelics. One point I'd like to raise is CBD has been, you know, we've seen that this is the gold on the market, if you want to call it that, in cannabis. But look at the price drop. I've been recently informed within the last month or so that CBD has gone from what was at least 6 months ago, 7 months ago, 4,500 US per kilo of isolate, down to 760, right? And it's something we predicted more on the market, more, you know, more supply, prices will go down, but it dropped pretty drastically. I'm curious to see what would happen.
Again, yeah, we look very closely at that continually, of course, and there isn't quite enough data points to get a good international picture on spot pricing just yet. We're seeing a lot of pricing differentiation from inside the United States, which has some of the best data collection, as opposed to Europe. And within the European Union, different countries that are recording are showing huge ranges in pricing. And of course, it also is very, very different if they're combining it with other molecules now. CBN, CBG, for example, are making up for the difference. And we're seeing some of the oils that are requesting specific formulations are still maintaining pricing, provided that you keep modifying the CVs to whatever it is that they're currently demanding. So we expected that. Sooner or later, it had to start to shake out. But it'll be interesting, as I said, for those that are just CBD players, what are you just doing? Like, I mean, are we just caffeine, or are we doing other into the beverage? Is there something else that's to be sold along with it? And if that's true, and you're demanding that producer produce exactly the same every cup, then that could be a very, very different world that we live in. But pricing and pricing tracking is going to be critical. But again, we need more data. So why don't we chat again about Europe? Europe is still very much kind of the center of the planet for larger market growth, but we've still got this issue about their differentiating as to how even CBD is still being derived, so to speak. Happy to see France got on board with the UN vote. That was a 180-degree turn from what they had before. But again, their issue, and with other countries having been overruled now, that CBD can't be put just directly into product. What do you guys predict for 2021? And let me say that on Panama's side, which is yet to pass legislation as they continue to muck about, we're finding CBC on the shelf everywhere. It's here. It's always been here, but now it's openly on the shelf here, even while we're still heading into second reading. So where do you guys see all of this heading for market? And if we were to sum up from each of us, how would you advise a government to deal with this today? What would you say to them? Marcus, let's start with you.
I would say, I mean, COVID-19 has a big part to play with 2021 as much as it seems as it had to play in 2020. This is not something that seems that it's ready to go away. We're seeing a number of countries experiencing second waves and executing full lockdowns now in November, December this year. Things will be tough, and I'm sure that governments will want to keep their focus on what they would term as more pertinent issues, but they also need to understand that this can be a relatively reasonably sized market for revenue for any country. With the decision coming out of the UNCND, I can't legally, personally, I don't think I could comment legally, but personally and professionally, I don't believe that countries would be in a rush to enter into non-medical adult use, or what we like to call recreational. I do believe in 2021, we will see a lot more countries look at medical legalization, medicalization, whichever you want to call it, and seek to bring some sort of standardization, I hope. I don't know from where. I was hoping it would come from the United Nations. Maybe it's going to come from Israel. Maybe it's going to come from the US federal government. But all our laws, as we were talking about just now, like in the Caribbean, when we make a law, first thing they direct us to do is to go into British law, Canada law, someone else's Commonwealth law, right? That's familiar because it's still Commonwealth. And that's one of the problems, Rob, also, that we don't, the governments in most countries, Africa even, they're not making decisions on their own, right? Their drafters are traditionally go towards legislation and pull from that, and whatever the big countries decide, it trickles down, because that's what we're trained to do. They don't hold a gun to our head anymore, but other countries are afraid. Developing countries are afraid to move further. I would advise governments to stop being so timid. And I mean, I'm not a legislative drafter, but I've been put in that position to work with legislative drafters in a number of countries in the Caribbean. And I can definitely say that even in Africa, where I've spoken to governments there, they've all been doing exactly that. They've all been waiting for another country. Countries that were British before would not follow American type of legislation or the format of. So they usually look towards British, towards Australian, Canadian, and these things. But governments need to open their minds a little more when it comes to legislation. Legislation does rule this industry, as it would with any other industry realistically, whether it be a toxic product, a product that is...
Sure. Well, anything that would be consumed, for sure.
Yeah, any consumable product, right? So my advice to them would be to seek legislation with a more open mind and from more countries. What I did in developing my proposed regulatory framework was look at every available legislative framework that was around, pull the best out of it. We saw we had enough time to see where those legislations made mistakes and errors. We left those out. And I added some novel stuff that would seek to aid the problems that still no legislation seemed to have here. And that's something, that's a practice that I would encourage all governments to use. You know,
Yeah,
simply
don't recreate the wheel and get a legislative framework that's country interoperable. We agree.
and realistically, you know, as myself, as part of TheraCann, it is important for governments to hire educated consultants. Most consultants these days that are going into countries and developing countries especially are going in from a large company. I wouldn't quote names today from some that I've seen, but they are, you know, they send someone that their regulator, they go to the government and say, okay, we can do this and that. And then they write the legislation to aid that specific company. And we've seen that a number of countries, Portugal.
Not in the best interest of the country, but in the best interest of the company.
So they should look at getting educated consultants that are independent, at least in their work towards this, and try to be a little more bold when making legislation towards cannabis, understanding that it's something that can bring revenue. It is something that can work and can work smoothly so long as they follow certain guidelines that are already set for other pharmaceuticals.
Agreed. Rob?
Well, problem in Europe is, in this case, the Canavape highlights is there needs to be a unifying standards, because they say, and I've lived in Europe for 9 years, the old analogy, heaven is where the police are British, the mechanics German, the French, the chef's French, the lover's Italian, and it's all organized by the Swiss. Whereas hell, the chefs are British, the mechanics French, the police German, the lovers Swiss, and it's all organized by the Italians. We very much have that analogy with cannabis, because you'll see that countries have their own ideas in Europe as what are the standards for milk? What are the standards? And without unifying principles that produce standardization, you're going to end up with decisions like this, which still, although they recognize that CBD is not a narcotic, it still gives the French national government, however, deference to the national courts of the member states to step in if there is a real versus hypothetical risk to public health, which without the studies, without the transparency, you could tie up legislation and EU law just by countries taking a national stance of national protectionism. And that's effectively one country could say this is a risk and others says nonsense. Nonetheless, that has to make its way through the court. So ultimately, I see the need for unification. And I also support and echo Marcus's concern that governments, whether it's European or African or in between, ultimately, they need to look at what's right for their situation and then adopt points from established international regime. But again, it's kind of a chicken and the egg scenario, and we certainly going into 2021, I think we'll have an easier job given the developments that we've discussed on this call, but there's still a long way to go. Chris?
Well, yeah, I agree. I also look at a variety of other data points and try to, from that, extrapolate direction. I was very happy to see in Q4, first time this year in 2020, capital was returning to the cannabis industry, first time in any measurable amount. In working with our vendors that we have right across the spectrum, they're busy now, which is even better. And what was also very encouraging is they survived COVID. I can't say the same in other sectors. And I've watched the devastation, even in oil and gas exploration, for example, is nowhere where it was entering 2020. A huge hemorrhaging with regards to staff and businesses are gone. Whereas in cannabis, they survived and many of them actually flourished and grew. So pun intended, that's a very positive sign. I also started to see the cannabis licensed producers taking their wherewithal and applying it to other crops, first time. Starting to look at what else could they be cultivating that is next in line. Because certainly the psychedelics are receiving a large share of investment fortune right now, which has been very encouraging. But the indoor cannabis growers learn how to grow indoors, finally. Some of them have done it exceptionally well. We certainly know the track record of those who didn't do it well at all, and as predicted, those facilities have shuttered, or they're in the process of shuttering. Either they're too expensive, or the quality was too low, or repeatability was non-existent, or it didn't matter. The market dominated the decision-making path on that, and those are out their way. But it developed technology that is now finding its home in vertical urban farming in a way that even vertical urban farming didn't understand. So the long story short, the technology has only had 7.5 years, but it has gone a long way. If you think of it in terms of the space age, we went from Yuri Gagarin to the moon effectively in 7 years. And we effectively developed most of that technology and regulatory framework and government interoperability within that same time frame, with a bunch of governments and groups that didn't even want to talk to each other. So that's really quite remarkable heading into 2021. I agree with both of you. It's still very largely, however, dependent on local governments to decide their priorities. Those governments that are struggling right now with economic hardship under COVID, they've got record numbers of depressed individuals. They certainly have incidents of PTSD, and of course, they've got very limited budgets, not just for COVID vaccine, but for managing the aftermath of what has turned out to be a rather traumatic pandemic for those individuals that were sequestered, not for days or weeks, but months with isolation. And that comes with a cost, both social capital as well as economic, that hasn't been addressed yet. If they came to the market with a good cohesive strategy as to how cannabis and other psychedelics could be brought to bear quickly at much lower cost than the alternatives that are on the market right now, which didn't go through all of this, and of course do it in a way that ensured that it was coming from a source that was repeatable, economic, practical, scalable, safe and secure, fully traceable, both for the product, for recall, and the dollars for the bank. Boy, that would be a happy place, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
So fingers crossed that will happen. We are seeing a number of governments at least focus on that for now. The proof is always in the pudding, as they say, the Christmas pudding. But I'm very happy to say we're coming out of 2020 looking a little sharper than we were heading in to the year from different parts of the planet. As I say, I'm so happy that Oceania is finally catching up. A variety of countries are doing so. Europe, United States, Canada does this thing, and Latin.
Mexico,
yeah. So gentlemen, thank you very much. Enjoy the remaining days in the year. I look forward to catching up with you in Q1, and let's start making some real predictions of where we see this market go. All right?
Definitely.
Thanks,
you,
everyone.
Good one.
All right. Have a great day. Happy Sunday.
Cheers, Marcus.
Good to see you guys.